Welcome in, everyone, as you're kind of adding yourself to this Zoom call. My name is Sammy Anderson. I'm our marketing manager here at Softcrylic. Thank you for joining us, our third installment of our CDP webinar series. Jerry Helou, our VP of Martech Strategies, is joined today by James Meyers, head of Martech Strategy at ActionIQ. So kind of have a dynamic duo there. We're going to be talking all things CDP implementation. I will launch a poll. So while they're kind of doing their introductions, feel free respond to that poll, kind of help give them insight onto who the crowd is, what's going to help them touch on throughout the webinar today. If you have any questions throughout, put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And then moving forward, if you have further questions that didn't get answered in the webinar, we will release a follow-up blog about this with the link to the recording, or reach out to us, info@softcrylic.com, and we'll make sure we get you in touch with who you need to talk to. And with all of that, I'll pass it off to you, Jerry, and we can kick things off.
Thank you, Sammy. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'll quickly introduce myself for some of the folks that don't know me. Jerry Helou. I've been with Softcrylic for a little over 5 years. I lead the solution architecture group. Been in the Martech space for a bit over a decade. We've been spending a lot of time, as you can tell from our series in CDP, spending a lot of time in the CDP space. So this session here is the third one of 5. In the first 2, we concentrated on what is the RFP process for a CDP, if anyone is considering, as well as what are the main things when it comes to getting ready for a CDP. And readiness, as well as I think we brought a previous client that talked about their experience. Today, I think this is going to be one of the real webinar where we get into the details of implementation. I invited James, who will introduce himself in a minute, but James, we've worked before, we've done webinars before. He used to be on the client side, he is on the vendor side, so he's seen it all. And our goal today is to give you a perspective on what to expect during implementation, and also what are the things to watch out for, so that you are having as successful as possible of an implementation. But James, let's kick it off with the quick intro about yourself.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you to Softcrylic for inviting me here today. Very excited to be talking about today's topic, and it's near and dear to my heart, having spent about 8 years on the practitioner side. Worked at Lowe's Home Improvement here in Charlotte, North Carolina, data engineering, data science, and then was kind of foolish or wise enough in 2013 to build a CDP, and then went to Gartner for a couple of years and studied the space and advised organizations and learned the pitfalls and the mistakes. And now working at ActionIQ, I'm continuing that technology advisor role, where I'm spending 70 or 80% of my week talking to executives on these same topics that we'll be discussing today. So Jerry, thanks again for the invite. This is gonna be a lot of fun. Let's jump right in. Yeah, man,
I feel like every time you introduce yourself, I feel like, man, I'm in the presence of James. This is an honor, man, because your expertise and the way you deliver this is awesome. So very happy to have you here. Okay, so what I want to do first, I want to spend a few minutes, just give a quick overview of what we envision are the 5 phases of implementation. I have a few slides, really conversational. James, as we talk through these, I know we're going to touch on those as we come back, but feel free to weigh in places where you feel you've seen like any input. We definitely want to keep that conversational. So, all right. So just to summarize, and there's really different terminology that can be followed, but when we look at an implementation of a CDP, we look at it as 5 phases, and we're going to go through what those are or what to expect. Kickoff, although that might be the shortest and most fun phase, but it's a critical one. But this is where things kick off the project. From there, we go typically into a discovery phase, and then into a design, then going live, and then finally wrapping up the CDP with what we call value realization, which is just proving what or showcasing the value that has been driven so far, as well as what to expect in next phases. So let's just go through what to expect in each of those. In a kickoff, I think the main things here that I would recommend, and also set the right expectations as you're doing a kickoff, very similar to kicking off any IT project, right? The CDP is a complex product. It has an IT and a business aspect to it. So aligning between you and the vendor or the system integrator on the project overview. Also getting an idea of what is the project plan. At that moment, the project plan is not going to be polished, but at least you need to have some dates in mind of what are the expectations. The project plan will always be work in progress and will be polished in the phases to come. In addition to that, obviously, this is the time where introductions will happen. So from the client side, bring in your team. Highly recommend having program management involved on your side, as well as some technical expertise. Again, enterprise architect is always a key resource, as well as your business stakeholders or any of the product owners that need to be involved. During kickoff, also, we discuss what is the cadence and the statuses. This is weekly meetings. What do we expect part of discovery? Start planning, start getting people's calendars. This is always a very difficult thing to do, given that I'm sure a lot of folks on the client side have multiple projects happening, so they might not be able to be fully dedicated. So definitely agree on the cadence and the statuses. In discovery, this is where we start digging into what we want to build. During the discovery, we will be mostly concentrating on the business aspect, because the goal of discovery is to walk away with documented requirements, clear on what are we going to be implementing in the CDP, what are the use cases we're trying to unlock. So there will be heavy data discussions as well to understand the reality of things. We don't want to have a disconnect where we walk away from discovery with saying, like, we want to do all these use cases, but then wait, none of these can be done because the data is not ready. There needs to be some kind of coordination, not fully where we're fleshing out all the data requirements, but enough to know that if there is any gaps, these gaps should be documented as well as prioritized, so that these can be worked out in parallel while some of the other things are happening, so that we can stay within the time frame for delivery. From discovery, we go into design. So this is where we're shifting from the business side into starting looking at the data and building the data model. Along the way, we're also updating the project plan with more details, because the output of the discovery also, we will be pinning down like the exact data sources, the exact destinations, any things that need to be set up. So that will now, and also any dependencies. So the project plan will evolve during this phase. But part of this too is going through and evaluating what is the data readiness. Is there any work that needs to be done on the client side, or even on the vendor side, in terms of receiving this data and getting it into the CDP? Any provisioning needs to happen. And then the goal is to have a solution design document that the client and the technical side of the client signs off on. So there is an agreement on this is what we're implementing. And I think this is really important, because the CDP, in many cases, you might be implementing it for one business unit, but you might have other business units that you want to bring in down the line. So any of the decisions that you make at this stage can be critical for the future. So that's why the solution design is important to be fleshed out and vetted, and an agreement from the technical, but also having the business weigh in just in case there's any future implications. And then finally, part of this phase, we like to set up all these things within a staging environment so that we can start bringing in sample data and start seeing things working. From there, we go into production. So in a go live phase, this is where we are moving things into production. Everything that was set up, we said any feeds will be production feeds, any destinations will be production destinations. This is where we start executing and activating, building segments, building journeys. And then also part of that, we will do the performance testing. This is important because you want to make sure that any of the expectations for the data availability and segment availability with the volumes that you're bringing in or the volumes that you're hooking into, there is no implication of performance. So that happens in there. And then finally, in the last phase with the value realization, this is where the handoff, preparing for what's going to happen post-implementation. So this is where a lot of training, enablement, change management. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. What are the right people and processes that should be in place? Maybe the client should hire some people to come in and get up to speed. These may be the technical folks or some of the gatekeepers. We'll also be providing a lot of the playbooks, runbooks, and recommendations. This way, you are in a good place to transition to the post-live implementation. So that's a summary. James, did I miss anything from the overview of the 5 phases of implementation?
Jerry, that was perfect. Only small thing I could think about there, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, is in that value realization phase, we want to be sharing successes and kind of doing roadshows of the future capabilities that are coming forward so that the business remains excited about the capabilities that have been achieved and what's coming next. So we'll get to that. So much fun stuff to talk about today, but that was spot on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, because we see in many cases, and it's a given, the CDP, it takes a village to implement it, and sometimes it's just by the end of implementation and you start executing, like there's a little of fatigue from folks involved. It's a long program. I mean, it's a 3 months to 4 months. It's heavy. I agree with you that the setting, like, okay, the next boost of like, okay, we went through the hard part. Now let's get things going. That would be important. I definitely want to talk through that. Okay, so you and I did a little bit of like discussions prior to this, just thinking about, okay, what are the things we feel that we should be telling some of the clients or folks who are considering a CDP or in the phase of evaluating vendors. And there was one topic that we said, okay, this is really important, which was readiness. The idea of readiness. And I think we highlighted few. One is data readiness. 2 was use cases, people, dependencies, and then also the creative and copy for activation. Let's start with data. What is, every CDP has a different, they operate differently. At the end of the day, they're the same, but some hook into different data sources. Some of them are structured, some are schema-less. So there's differences, but we all agree that there should be some data readiness. How do you recommend for clients who are stepping into this? What should they be thinking about behind the scene with their own data warehouse, their own data people, to be ready for a CDP?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And the way I'll frame my responses as we go forward in our discussion is I'm going to try and use an old method versus the better or the new method to kind of create some contrast. And when it comes to data readiness, the old way that I think organizations used to think was that, we should try to unify all of our data, right? Every little piece, we're going to try and bring it all into the CDP and create the most robust customer 360 you could ever imagine. And this isn't a good idea. And the reason it's not a good idea is because that's a never-ending objective. You'll never get 100%, even if you try. And I've been there, 13, 14, 15 different data sources, and the list just keeps adding on. So new channels like ratings and reviews or CSAT, customer reviews and so forth. Anyway, it just never stops. And so the better way, I think, of your data readiness is to start with a subset of your data. And that's to Jerry's point earlier, it's all about expectation setting. You want to have clear expectations with your stakeholders to say, hey, look, we're not going to try and boil the ocean here and get every piece together. Instead, start off with determining your business goals, right? And those business goals can be things like incremental revenue, cost savings, customer satisfaction, loyalty, et cetera. And then determine what use cases support those business goals. And once you know those use cases, you can determine the data. And this is the final step, right? You can determine the data that enables those use cases. So the benefit of going in this process is it's much more efficient, and it gives you a higher probability of achieving those use cases in a timely manner. And we'll talk about more about the individual objectives and use cases a little bit later on. But I'm trying to create the contrast between the expectation of boiling the ocean with all of your data versus just harnessing the data that would support your use cases. Jerry, you agree with that?
I do. I think it's always the same. It's the right story to tell, where yes, you need to have the use cases. The use cases define the data. So there's, you never know, like, which one do I start with? Do I look at the data and what data is available to fuel the use cases? I think it's a push and pull type of approach, that both of these, it's not going to be easy, but by hammering both in a way, you will get to a point. The one thing I would add is, from a data readiness, and we've been seeing this a lot, is sometimes it's not only about like the cleansing and the identifying what are the data sources, but also some conversations, especially around identity and in some cases consent, because yes, you are going to be bringing systems not all at once, but then from a data completeness down the road, is there any decisions that need to be made before we bring this data into the CDP? Do we need to agree on what are the identities that we want to identify that would be critical for the CDP? What are if there's any changes? For example, recently, one thing we noticed is that some clients are, they don't have any authentication on the site, but they want to merge on site and offline information. They have a lot of customer information. So because of that, required some data readiness, where they wanted to enable, for example, their emails to send a hash version of a customer ID that is able to connect some of the site behavior and the customer data. But doing that early on was very beneficial, because this way we didn't have much of a dependency on it when we went into implementation. So I would say, as much as you can, think through some of these things, that especially identity, especially the data sources, and then hand in hand, find which of these use cases set what criteria and priority, so that you can get some of that work done ahead of the implementation.
Yeah, that's a great point. Almost like an audit of your data readiness. So not just the sources, as you were saying, and not just the cleanliness of the data, as you were saying, but how well does it fit together? In other words, does an identity from one system join nicely with identity from another system? So your web data to your transaction data to your marketing data, and having people who have experienced that from a join perspective, people who have come up with business rules. You want to include those people in the kickoff, just as you had mentioned, Jerry, and ensure that there's visibility and that there's there's respect for the nuances of consent and the nuances of data readiness is the wrong word, but its appropriateness for the use cases that you're trying to achieve. So really good points there, Jerry. One question for you: when it comes to kind of the cleanliness of data, certainly different types of CDPs are either bringing cleansing capabilities or bringing transformation capabilities, and other CDPs do not. You also mentioned kind of schema and schema-less types of CDPs. The only thing that I wanted to bring up here was if your organization is not at the point of having all your data cleansed and transformed exactly the way that you imagine it to be in the future, you do have a benefit of using a CDP that is not schema rigid, a CDP that does bring the capability to transform data and still maintain that raw image of the data underneath it, so that you get the flexibility later. But it's important for people to know that, hey, if my organization is not ready, we don't have super clean data, then I can't even go begin the path of the CDP. And the answer is yes, you still can. You just need to select the right type. Does that make sense?
I agree. This is actually what comes up a lot of times when we do an RFP evaluation. One of the comparisons we do based on the client needs. If the client says, I really do not want to do any data prep, and I know my data is not clean, but my data warehouse team, my IT team, I love them, but they're busy and I cannot, if I'm going to get on their schedule, this is going to be like a 5-year project. So I really need to move fast. And this is where we're like, oh yeah, by the way, there's some CDPs that allow you to do so. So yeah, great point. I think, again, CDPs as a functionality, data collection, segmentation, activation, they're very similar, but they're not all the same. That's one example that you just mentioned, 100%. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about use cases. The idea of use cases where, in some case, sometimes I feel like, okay, let's set it this way. You might, and maybe you and I can debate about this, but I don't think you want to walk into a CDP implementation expecting to implement 5 to 10 use cases. I think that is wild because that's a lot. The same way bringing 10 data sources from beginning, also a lot of work. Expensive because it would be expensive to do. So I always recommend to my prospects and my clients is, hey, why don't you pick 1 to 2 use cases that they lay the foundation of what is critical, gives you a good overview of what is needed. So enough sample information from different data sources, enables the stitching, allows you to do the segmentation, allows you to create the end-to-end experience, but then enough that you can build on top. What's your perspective on that? Is that 1 to 2 use cases is good, or do you think there's a different approach?
Jerry, I'm smiling only because you're a vet, you're a pro. You've been through this enough to know that is the best way. But I do want to ask you, talk about some of the benefits of why you think that is the better approach.
Yeah, so obviously you can do a lot more use cases, but timeline becomes longer. And then dependency on more data sources, which will just stretch the project. I think given how heavy and elaborate the CDP is in the implementation phase, you want to go through that in my opinion, as fast as you can, doing it right, to be ready to then grow and scale and do more. So that's why if we concentrate on the specific use cases, one, we have more buy-in, quicker to move from IT and business. This is new for a lot of people in the organization. So this gives them their test drive of it. And then by the end of it, now you have folks who have gone through it, folks who are using it, there is enough enablement and documentation, then the time to go to add another use case or to add another data source or to expand more data attributes, it's going to be way faster. When you have more than 2 use cases running in parallel, then your concentration during implementation is you're splitting your attention across multiple use cases, and then you want to show value for all of them. Then it's just going to move. We're not good at multi-threading as humans. We don't have the AI capability. So that's why I would say limited use cases, but important that they are showcasing what is the reality. Don't pick the easiest use cases. Pick the ones that will lay the foundation.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Jerry. Let's talk a bit about coming up with those use cases to begin with. One of the common problems I've seen historically is organizations would say, "Well, I'll come up with the use cases next, or I'll do it later." And what they're really saying is they're going to do it during their spare time. And the reality there is either they don't do it well, so they kind of half blanket, if you know what I mean. And I don't want to swear, but the other is, or they rely on the vendor to do it for them, right? And neither of those is going to lead to long-term success. And so what I've heard from organizations that do this best is they deliberately ask stakeholders from not just the business side, but also from the IT side to join together and say, let's get together in one room. Let's determine where the points of friction are in our customers' engagements with our brand. And we're going to then brainstorm the use cases that would make that friction go away, right?
Yeah.
And after you've identified those use cases, you can even do like the next step, which is kind of a pro tip here, align them to the phases of the customer lifecycle so that they're organized and classified well. This can help you later on when it comes to the value realization steps. But the biggest point here, and you make this a few seconds ago, Jerry, which is that don't just pick the easiest use case. Make sure that it brings some value, right? That showcases that this was the right investment for your organization. And I have a coworker, really smart guy. He calls this weighted shortest job first. So it's a term that's used in engineering. And what you're doing is, let's say you've got a long list of use cases. You're going to classify them in 2 ways. One is the amount of value that they would bring. And the other column next to it, beyond the value, is the amount of effort that it's required to implement that use cases. And so the best organizations are saying, let's rank the list based on the highest value ones that are the easiest to implement. So that way the organization gets quick wins with high value. And from that point, you're getting off the ground quickly. You're demonstrating that this is the right investment for your organization. And you still have a roadmap of high value use cases that you're going to achieve that are just incrementally more difficult and more effort thereafter. Does that make sense, Jerry, as a good idea?
Yeah. So is in that case, then the way that you're prioritizing is just a formula that is combining the weighted and the level of effort. Yeah, I never thought of it this way, but yeah, I like this. I might use that terminology because it makes sense. And the idea of getting people in the same room, I know this is so difficult, not because there's beef between IT and business. It's just they have different priorities, right? Business sees things in a different glasses compared to IT. And in some cases, they do speak a different language. So the CDP is going to be that new dialect that these guys need to both learn, because it needs both, right? You need the IT for the data, and then marketing needs, or the business, they need to execute and also provide the IT with more data so they can do more stuff. So absolutely. This ties directly into people, right? So the next thing about is people readiness. One thing I noticed in implementations, there's a perception from the client saying, we spent so much money on buying the CDP. we're spending tons of money on an SI or professional services to implement it, and we should be good. And then they really get surprised when I say, wait a minute, I need from your side a program manager, I need a business owner, I need a product owner, I need a technical lead. And they're like, what do you mean? What are we paying all this money for? So, and this is where I try to explain that I can run this doing it my own way, but I'm going to do it my own way. That means that you guys are going to have to live with what we decide on, and that's never a good idea. So what is your recommendation on who, as the clients, what should they do to prepare their team for a successful implementation?
Yeah, Jerry, I'm smiling here as well.
I know how to make you smile.
It's an expectation perspective, right? I mean, how do we set the expectation early that this is a foundational tool for your Martech stack going forward? This is not a point solution used by a couple people. This is something that's going to enable and optimize every other tool that is in your stack. Maybe not optimize every one, but at least probably have to integrate with at some point. And so you treat it as such. It doesn't mean just signing a contract with a vendor and expecting that to include all of the support along the way. So think of it this way. What we recommend to organizations is we say, first off, please have an executive leader or an executive sponsor, someone who can set the vision, someone who can be a point of escalation in case there needs to be extra support from one side or the other. As you mentioned, a project manager, because day to day, this is a relatively complex solution, and we want to make sure that it stays on track, that the right people are coming to the table when they need to come to the table, and they're not getting in the way when they're not needed at the table.
Yeah, I can't stress enough that project manager program, because there's going to be not only tons of meetings happening, but someone needs to hold on the client side people accountable. Exactly. Right? Because otherwise people are not showing up to meetings, people are not signing off, project delayed, and then you're not going to come and yell at the system integrator because there's so much they can do, right? They can ask people to join, but we don't know who is the right person that understands this, Salesforce data source or something like that needs to be managed internally. So I will double down on the importance of a program/project manager.
Yeah, 100%. It's in fact, in our perspective, it's the most important role. The other, obvious roles are your end users, your marketers or your marketing ops teammates. But the last big role, in our opinion, is someone who knows your data, someone who can call themselves either a data analyst or a data engineer, someone who knows how data is joined together and where the data is coming from, has access to the sources of it. But the best news here is that most of these roles are not needed ongoing. So if you think about it from an investment perspective, you can calm the fears of, hey, this is an extra expense by just saying, no, this is really a medium temporary expense, right? It's not going to be needed forever. So ongoing, I wanted to ask you, Jerry, roles that you see as being ongoing versus the ones that are required just at the outset, what would you say?
Yeah, I agree that it is. The CDP is front heavy in terms of the time commitment because we want to do it right. And then I think post implementation, going into running and operating, typically you do want to have some data oversight, because there's always going to be ideas. You're continuously pumping data into the CDP. This can be incremental, this can be full refresh. And also there's going to be situations where we want to expand on the data. So having folks from the data side involved to a certain extent is important. And then your users, your end users. So people are trained on how to build segments, trained on how to build journeys and orchestrations. These are these are, I would say, the two main ones. It doesn't hurt to have an enterprise architect who is overseeing this as well, post implementation, because the idea is like you mentioned, the CDP is going to integrate with your existing ecosystem, right? For example, you're sending emails today, and you want eventually to shift your segments or your audiences to be coming from the CDP. That might not be what happens day one when you stand up the CDP, because CDP is just you standing it up to make it ready. But then there, maybe the post go live, now there's a new project of how do we get to use the CDP to trigger and send audiences to our email, the marketing ops. That's, in that case, not only that you need to change how things are structured on that endpoint to bring in this new data source, but also there might be some implications of integration. So that's where you might want to spin up a different team with an enterprise architect overseeing it to make sure that is done properly.
Yeah, yep, completely agree. The word you use, I think, is the operative word here, which is more of it's not a day-to-day overseeing. It's more of a, like, maybe half of their everyday job. They might be overseeing the CDP as well as other technologies that are adjacent to it, and therefore they're not bound to just this one tool inside of the Martech stack,
right?
Because it doesn't require that much bandwidth, but could be half of their job. It could be a third of their job. But yeah,
I would say my recommendation to their clients is ask your system integrator what is early on, before you even do the kickoff, what do they expect from you? And also, what is the time commitment? Because like in our case, we usually say we need an enterprise architect 15 hours a week for the first few phases, and then we'll bring it down to 5 or 10. We need a data architect this area. We need the marketing. These are the things. Like, ask your system integrator to tell you what do they need from you and time commitments, so then you can take that and resource, right? You gotta source these people, and also reflect to them what is your internal processes. Like, one thing not many people they underestimate is sign-offs of things, right? Where, oh, we did this, and then we give it to the client, and the client is going to sign off. We move to the next one. Yeah, but the clients might have like their own way of signing off and review, and that might be like a 2 to 3 week time frame. If we're talking about a 14-week or a 12-week implementation, every time we're going to do a sign off 3 weeks, that's going to be a problem. So how do we do that? I definitely asking for resource allocation and any commitments early on will be highly recommended.
Yeah, that's a pro tip right there. The sign off process. Let's get that firmed up and sped up if need be. Because it only hurts both parties to have that be a lengthy process. I
agree. I know we're spending a lot of time on readiness, and this has been great. But the last piece before we move on to the next topic is this idea of creative and copy for activation. So just to set what that means. In CDP, the idea is we're activating campaigns where, let's say your campaign might be, let's say you're a retailer and you want to launch, hey, I have, I'm going to take a simple example, abandoned cart. People who are abandoning my cart, I want to merge their action that they did on the site with some information I know about them based on their previous purchase history. And I want to send them an abandoned cart, but in a little bit more meaning to it, not only saying, hey, you forgot this in your cart. To do so, that means, what is the activation? Is it through email? Okay. If it's through email, what is going to be the email content? So a lot of people underestimate that we need to create a specific email for this. So you cannot, you have your email marketing and email ops already doing stuff. You want to make sure that you work with them, understand, okay, we're going to give you data, we're going to trigger it in a certain way, but what is going to be the email? What are information we want to tokenize and personalize in the email to be reflected based on the information we're providing you? So that creative and copy is critical to be planned ahead of time or during the process of discovery and maybe design. Also, let's say SMS. If you're trying to do a push, an SMS or push notification, that stuff is important. Not only from it takes time to create, but also time to approve. There might be different departments, different brands that need to be involved. That's usually overlooked. And the problem that we run into is we get to activation, we get to that go live stage, and we're like, oh, we're ready. We have our audiences. We send them to the marketing automation tool, and then we're like, but wait, we don't have an email to send, nothing. So then we're in a holding pattern. As a system integrator, I want to wrap up this project, and as a client, I want to see this working, but then we're not able to do it. So I think be ready for that. Do you want to comment on that as well?
I do,
because you've
Jerry.
seen this on the client side as well.
Absolutely.
Interesting perspective.
Yeah, no, I mean, think about it from the earlier step we were talking about with your use cases, and we were going to rank them by the value that they would bring, but also the effort that they would require to fulfill the use case. And so if you think about the effort here, you bring up the excellent point, which is the effort is not just the CDP effort, it's also the downstream activation channel effort. Yeah. And if you think about that as a combination, you're going to have to create content, you're going to have to create copy, you're going to have to get sign off. There's legal teams and so forth that also usually have to sign off on new campaigns. And then I'll take it even one step further.
Legal, that's right. Like, yeah. I always forget. I should never forget about legal, but they need to take their time, right? But then that needs to be considered 100%. Thank you for bringing that up.
Make friends with your legal team if you're listening to this today. It can only benefit you. But the other part that I was going to bring up here, beyond just the high level of content and creative, is that imagine that you have a use case where you're not just trying to fulfill on one channel, you're trying to fulfill on multiple channels, right? It could be a multi-step journey or a multi-step campaign. And in that scenario, each channel has its own types and sizes and formats of content that it needs to fulfill. So a website would need different size creative than an email and versus a landing page from a text message, or even direct mail is another one. So the point being, you need a solution and some strategy ahead of time to decide all those different sizes of data, of copy and creative, and make sure that that's being calculated again into the initial ranking of your use cases and how much effort it would take to fulfill them. What I hear from organizations, and I'll stop here, is just that the CDP's job is to unify customer data and to enable orchestration across all the channels, but you still need the same replica for your content. Your content also needs to be API based. It needs to store different formats. It needs to be classified and tagged for different channels and different use cases, because the two systems will ultimately need to work in tandem when it comes to the endpoint activation. I think it's a really good point that you bring up about not forgetting the endpoints, Jerry. Yeah,
it's funny you said that towards the end, because, and I blame the salespeople, is that sometimes the perception is a CDP is also a campaign management, right? And a DAM, managing all assets, and in reality, it's not there. It's really, for good CDPs, in my opinion, are CDPs that do a good job in managing data, that you can create segmentation in audiences. It's an audience hub, a customer hub. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. All right, so we got 13 minutes and we still got a few topics I want to make sure we spend enough time on. One, which we kind of talked about here and there, but I know that's something we wanted to bring up, is what are the main challenges and pitfalls that we would recommend to avoid I'm happy to start with one, and then we'll go back and forth. We talked a little bit about this, but it's the dependencies. I think early on, identify if there's any dependencies for the success of this project. So what I usually instruct my project manager is defining and agreeing on with the client on what is the critical path. I feel very blessed. I've worked with clients where I learned this the hard way, where we need to be in agreement, critical path, because not all the time it's on us, it's sometimes on them. Many times it's on them. So defining what's the critical path. If you don't do that and you don't have the dependencies well laid out, then there will be delays in the project plan, and there will be delays in the delivery, and no one's going to be happy. So don't shy away from having that difficult conversation with your internal teams, as well as with the system integrator, and saying, I cannot do this. Like, we cannot, for example, do this tagging to allow this. Like, that is a critical piece and we cannot do it. Let's figure out a way how to work around it. I would rather that be tackled early on rather than just delaying things and just the project goes on hold. So that's mine.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Jerry, I'll ask you for a couple other examples of dependencies. You know, we've talked about identity as a dependency. We've talked about content as a dependency. Give folks a little bit more examples of what needs to be classified as a dependency here. Yeah,
so in many cases, identity is one, right? And the example I said about the tag management, this is where making sure that you have connection between online and offline. Another dependency is some of the internal, on the client sides, there might be some migrations happening in place where there's dependency that we cannot bring this data until we migrate into the new system. Another is, and we've been seeing this quite a bit, clients are, in many cases, they want to do this, the CDP, along with other things at the same time. So they might be migrating to a new email system, implementing a new marketing and like web analytics. Their mobile app, for example, might be going through a remodeling. They are also implementing site personalization, and then their CDP, they want to, the main use case is an orchestrated multi-channel type of journey. So you can see here, like, okay, we will work on the audience, but then site personalization is one dependency. Having your email is ready is another dependency. So then those need to be laid out. That's one. And then there's other dependencies that can be internal, where, for example, consent. We're working with a client in healthcare, and it's been an incredible journey because we're seeing and understanding. On one side, as a marketer, you just want to have access to all the data, and you want consent, and you want to do all these things. But on the other side, as a patient, you're like, yeah, but this is my information. Like, I don't want to be harassed to give consent. So with that, we were able early on identify that there's going to be a dependency, and the client has been working through with legal, with the data team, with even the doctors, because they're working with doctors and the insurance, to figure out, like, how is the right way for us to up our consent game, where we're not being, I'm going to say this, we're not like Facebook giving like a very, hidden consent requirements, but we are being clear on what is the consent, but at the same time, not losing people, right? Like, we want to market to them to give them better service. So these are some of the dependencies, and I think critical part to account for them early on the project.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, especially the co-deployments of multiple solutions at the same time. Let me give two quick ones here. These are kind of pitfalls to avoid. The first here that I hear over and over from another teammate, Tamara, who's when it comes to this. It sounds very simple, but enormous ramifications of requiring your vendor to be a partner instead of just a vendor. And what that means is that it's a mindset and something that we hear over and over again of brands that have tried other CDP vendors and said we weren't getting the support, we weren't getting any best practices, we weren't learning and finding new ways to achieve our business objectives. There's going to be points of uncertainty with any brand where they're looking for shortcuts to success, and there's enormous value from tapping the vendor as a distributor of those best practices. And so that's the first quick one. The second one is all about when it comes to your organization. Jerry, you brought this up maybe 20 minutes ago, which is there's going to be people who have immediate use cases of the CDP, and then there's going to be people who find out about how successful it's going, and they say, well, I want to solve my problems with the CDP too. And that's going to require more budget. And I stopped there and I put some emphasis on it, because if you're not regularly sharing your wins with your executive sponsors, if you're not doing those roadshows to the broader company, and these are things through QBRs, regular Slack updates, then the people around the organization who are in control of the budget are going to be more reluctant to give it to you when you want to expand new use cases. So share those wins with leaders early and often to make it much easier down the road when you need to justify a new budget. So those are the two quick ones. We've got a bunch of others that we could get into, Jerry.
Oh my God, there's so many. Yeah,
this is fun.
Yeah, I think one thing I would say to wrap up that section is that it's not only about the technology, right? You're implementing complex technology, but make sure you double down on the people and process. I know this is the cliche, we always say it, people, process, platform, but God, if anything that the CDP has proven is that this is the tool that will test these to the limit. You can have the right technology, and if you slack on the other two, you will feel it early on. And this is critical that you don't fall into that. So idea of having a program management in place, idea of identifying the right people, aligning on what are the dependencies, all of these are going to be critical that you end up implementing things on time, but also you're implementing the right thing. Don't fall into the situation where we just need to finish this project. No, like we want to do this right, and because otherwise this is just going to be another product that sits on the shelf. If IT is not convinced that this is valuable for them, they're not going to play nice. If business doesn't see this as a product that they can change things, like I'll give you the example of the DMP, right? I come from that space. One of my favorite tools was the DMP until the CDP now. But the reason I feel that died is because we failed at showing the real value of the DMP, as well as it had a lot of gaps in it. But I don't want us to do the same with the CDP. Have the IT people see the value, have the marketers get usability of it and drive value. Then you'll be working with a product that will unlock an incredible use cases for you and your organization.
Yeah, great point. And speaking of DMPs, we should do another webinar someday about replacing DMPs.
Yes, yeah,
that'd be fun.
I agree. All right, so we got 3 minutes, and I think I want to give you time to talk about, because I think this is something you early on you mentioned, and we talked about it when we did the prep, is the measuring of success and ROI. And then how to create this roadmap for short and long-term value. Do you want to talk about like how, it's easy to say, but then in reality, it's a bit complex to put in place, because you're going to be concentrating a lot on activation, but how do you structure as a client, as someone getting into the space? How do I structure my mentality to prove and show value and return on investment?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll start off by continuing to echo my teammate Tamara's advice here, and she says set clear and measurable KPIs. Kind of vague terms, so let's crystallize them a bit here. Let's start off and say that pretend your one of your major challenges today is speed to market, right? And so you're saying that, hey, maybe it takes us 40 days to get a campaign from idea to implementation. And so you want to shorten that, right? Your KPI should not be, I want to shorten my campaign time to market. That's not a KPI.
Right.
Right?
Right. No.
That's a goal, but it's not
It's an objective. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So a good KPI would be, we want to shorten our campaign time to market by 70% or more. And so what that means is that before you begin implementing the CDP, take stock, right? Measure how long it takes to do every one of your day-to-day processes. And it doesn't mean like an enormous list of everything you've ever done, but the major tasks that you go through, things like how long it takes to build a segment, things like how long it takes to get a campaign to market. Think about how long it takes to iterate the definition of a segment, or how long it takes to get a multi-channel campaign out. I don't know.
Yeah.
The point being that
Set the baseline.
Set the baseline.
Yeah.
So it has to be clear, it has to be measurable, and make sure that those KPIs and those measurements are being tracked. Don't give up on them like many organizations do, and they say, oh yeah, we'll get to that later. No, like this will help you gain budget. This will help you gain. And some people's, they don't care about budget. They care about getting a promotion, right? So whatever makes you tick.
Yeah.
Don't give up on KPIs. What about you, Jerry? What do you think?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think this is where I would recommend for the clients, as they are in the discovery phase, push your system integrators in the BRD and requirements that they're gathering to highlight what are the KPIs. If they're not asking you what are your KPIs, then there's a problem. Make sure that that is being documented and there's a plan to measure it. Sometimes the measurement, CDPs, depending on the CDP you're using, it might not have that representation layer, right, or the presentation layer to do reporting. So there might be requirements to pull some of that data into your own reporting, or you invest in in pulling queries and SQL and such, but plan for it. Yeah. I agree. And then because this is exactly what happens. You show wins, you get people excited, and people want to do more. This doesn't work, people lose interest, and then we have a problem. And I agree. And I think related to that is those objectives. It's really good to map out what you want to get out of the CDP in year one during the implementation, and what your typical crawling phase, right? And then what do you want to get to in the walking in year two, and then post, right? I usually say crawl, walk, run, and fly. Like, what do we want to do when we're flying? How fast we want to get to that? And yeah, that should be mapped out so that there is that short-term vision that's concentrating on let's get things working and ready. But then from there, once this is done, how do we go to the next one and the next one? The same way you're getting your prospects into a marketing funnel, then get your flying into different use cases from one phase to another. You want to be able to know how to jump from one to the other.
Yeah, the sequencing is really, really important, and it can go back to your use case generation back in step one. That becomes your roadmap. So it's a recyclable asset. Certainly, it might change over time. Things may become less difficult or more effort and less effort, but enormous value from that roadmap because it inspires innovation from people on a daily basis. Like as you're presenting KPIs and the wins of your efforts, bookend that with the roadmap. Say, hey, by the way, we just achieved this, but here's where we're going next.
Yeah.
So people always have the vision and inspiration for innovation. I think that's like one of the best things about a CDP is it inspires other organizations or other departments within the organization to think differently.
I agree.
So,
I agree. James, this has been, I had so much fun. I feel like we can do another hour on this because there's few other things. We didn't even talk about like how to prepare for run and operate. So we'll have you back. We'll do this. Would love to, maybe part of the wrap up of the series, we can bring you in, planning on bringing some clients in this space as well. And we'll talk about the entire experience and maybe have like a quick, more tips and tricks on how to do this better. But thank you so much. This has been great talking to you. A lot of good feedback and input from you. I'm 100% sure that whoever is going to be watching this is going to walk away with a couple of good nuggets to help them in this journey.
Yeah, I'm honored to do it with you, Jerry. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
All right, my man. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Thank you all. This will be recorded, obviously, and on the website in probably in a week or so. So reach out if you have any questions to me and James, and talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.